Well, hello there. Brent here with Bring Your Own Tools. On today's episode, if you want to learn how to make a fully custom barn door with an IKEA mirror, keep on watching. Let's get started. Just don't worry about that crack. We'll get that taken care of. For this project, it all starts with the slab. And for our slab, we are using black American walnut, and I will leave a link in the description box below on where I've personally find a few of these amazing slabs. Now, if you're lucky enough to find a wide enough slab that you can just cut in half, perfect, because you can just do that. However, in my circumstance, I was only able to find one slab, but luckily for me, it was so thick that I could just cut it in half with my table saw, at least as far as I could go. In order to cut the remainder, I set up my laser level and align it with the cut that I've already placed. If you need to adjust it a bit, you can always use some shims on one side and then make sure it's aligned properly on the other side. Then clamp it down in place and grab your reciprocating saw. Yes, I did say reciprocating saw. Surprisingly, because there's a cut on the back side, it provides a guide for the reciprocating saw to follow, and as long as you do your very best to follow that laser line all the way down, you can have a very accurate cut, surprisingly. This is a 2-inch thick slab, so each section is going to be approximately 1 inch thick, which is perfect for the purposes of this project. Sometimes things just work out better than you can anticipate, and this was actually very nice that we didn't have to use a bandsaw. We just were able to use a reciprocating saw to somewhat evenly cut these boards in half, or cut this board in half. Now, we just need to make sure it's smoothed out on both sides and get ready for assembly. I pick up my DeWalt rotary sander and start sanding away the areas in which the reciprocating saw was a bit rough too. Now keep in mind the flat planed area is going to be the side that's going to be going up against your mirror. However, the side that we took the reciprocating saw to is going to be the exterior portion that people actually see. So you want to sand it up as evenly as possible, but it doesn't have to be perfectly even all the way down the board. And in all honesty, I feel like this provides a more natural feel and it gives it a little bit more character. And you all know how much I love a little character. But we do want this board perfectly smooth, so after we're done with our rotary sander, I do take my random orbital sander and go over all of the edges of the board in order to have as smooth of a feel as possible. As for sandpaper, my rotary sander had 100 grit, and when I moved onto my random orbital sander, I started with 100, then went to 150 and 200 grit. But at the tail end, especially to get around some of those tight-knit live edge corners, I did take a free piece of sandpaper and smoothed over those edges as well. Once all the sanding was complete, I took some mineral spirits with a clean lint-free cloth and wiped off any of the sawdust that I could. However, after it's dry, I do always suggest taking a tack cloth because as you can see, the tack cloth will get up all the sawdust that the mineral spirits left behind. Now it's time for finish, and for this project we are using Armasil Satin Finish by General Finishes. I apply a very heavy coat to the front of each board as well as the sides. However, I don't apply a coat to the back side because the back side is going to be attached to the mirror and we're going to be using an adhesive for that. After I let this heavy coat seep in and set for approximately 10 minutes, I then go back to it and remove all of the excess with a clean lint-free cloth. And you do want to make sure you completely remove any of the excess of this finish. I let the finish dry overnight, then flip the boards over because we are ready for assembly. Now the barn door that I'm trying to make is going to be approximately 36 inches by 80 inches tall, and for that we need a very large mirror. However, it's really hard to find a large mirror locally without trying to do some custom mirror work, which is extremely expensive. Which is why I'm extremely happy that I was able to find this amazing mirror at IKEA, which was over 77 inches tall. Now it's not as tall as I want it to be, but it's close enough, and you'll see later how we extend the length of this mirror just a bit. Now this mirror did come with an aluminum frame system, but it was extremely easy to remove and left this perfect mirror panel. After I placed the mirror on top of our wood slab, I did make sure the layout was appropriate on all 4 sides, and then I made an outline determining exactly where the mirror is placed on those slabs. 1, because I know exactly where we need to put our adhesive, and 2, I know exactly where the mirror needs to be positioned once we place it back on top of our wood boards. As for the adhesive that we're using for this project, we are using Fuse It by Liquid Nails. Now this specific product is formulated even for mirrors because it says it right in the instructions. And that's why I know for certain that it's the appropriate product to fuse this wood to this mirror in a very nice, orderly fashion. Now, once I have the mirror positioned and laid appropriately, I then grab a 1/4 inch thick piece of plywood. I make a mark at 35.5 inches on both sides, lay down our homemade track saw assembly, and cut the board to the appropriate width and length, of course. This plywood I picked up at Home Depot, and it's a 4x8 foot sheet. And luckily we do have extra because we will be using the strips for the sides of our door. I cut out 2.5 inch wide strips because these will be placed on the sides, and I also cut out small pieces for the very bottom as well as the very top of our door. This plywood is the same thickness as our mirror, and we do this because we don't want any gaps on the sides of our door prior to installing our trim all the way around it. Now the trim is going to be steel, but we'll get to that momentarily. I lay our back panel on the mirror, make a mark to determine where the opening is at the very bottom as well as the very top, and then cut out that small section with my jigsaw. Now we're doing this because I don't want this area to be seen once we actually have the mirror set up and in place, so keep that in mind on your project depending on the size of the door that you need. I apply a vigorous amount of Fuse It adhesive to the back of the mirror, then place our panel right in position, and let's start clamping. Now in retrospect, I wish I didn't use so many clamps because I probably could have gotten away with one at the very bottom as well as one at the very top, and then put a couple weights in the very middle. By clamping it in the middle, I feel like that's where it actually cracked, and I did look after I removed all the clamps and didn't see any cracks. However, there was a crack. We'll get to that shortly. As we wait for our adhesive to set, I grab some 1.5 by 1.5 angled steel and start marking out some layouts for our fasteners. Now I'm laying out these fasteners every foot as well as 1 inch in on the ends. Once I have all my fastener marks noted, I go over to my drill press and I use a 1/4 inch cobalt drill bit. This is the preferred drill bit to use when drilling into steel like this, and the drill press really does make it a lot easier to do multiple runs, as you can see. However, you still can do this with your standard drill as well as a cobalt drill bit, but it's going to take a lot more time and energy to do so. I do also highly suggest using some cutting oil that's also specifically designed to cut into metal. That will make your drill bit last a lot longer, as well as making the drilling process even easier. This steel came in 6-foot lengths, and therefore we did have to cut a number of pieces down to length, especially for the top and the bottom. Now the top and bottom I am cutting at approximately 36 inches wide, and in order to cut them properly, I'm using a metal cutting blade in my grinder. These metal cutting blades do an amazing job at cutting down this material to length very quickly, and once we have them to the proper length, I do have to make a bit of notching in order for these pieces to lay perfectly flush together. I make a mark at the exact point where the vertical piece is going to hit the horizontal piece, and that's where I'm going to cut because I want the vertical pieces to be running up all the way to the very top and not even be able to see where the top and bottom meet the sides. Now this might seem a bit complicated up front, but I assure you it's actually quite simple, and every single section just needs 2 cuts, one here and one here, and then you're done. Well, you do have to do it to each side, but you get my gist. If this is done correctly, this should fit very snugly like so. After we have it positioned, we do make marks indicating exactly where our hole placements need to be placed on these top and bottom panels, but once we have these noted and drilled appropriately, we can move on to finishing. Well, actually, if you really want to have a nice professional look and feel, I do suggest using a countersinking drill bit to just drill out a slight amount into every single hole. That way our fasteners can fit flush against our trim. That's going to provide a really nice professional look and feel in the end, and that's what I'm always looking for on this channel. After we have our countersinking taken care of, I do highly suggest cleaning all of your steel prior to painting. And for cleaning, my #1 degreaser that I use is Brake Parts Cleaner because it does an amazing job at degreasing anything in any surface. Go ahead and spray it on, wipe it off, and we're ready to paint. As for paint, we are using a Rust-Oleum enamel with a satin finish. Now my trick for spray paint to leave a nice clean finish is to make sure you're using a thin layer of paint. Making sure that they're a little bit thinner versus a thick coat will reduce the chances of drips, and no one likes drips. As we wait for our metal to dry, we can get back to our door because our adhesive is dry. Now to make sure we have a perfectly square door, I do line up my track saw and cut off a small section at the very bottom as well as the very top of the door so we have a clean surface to drill into. But after we have that taken care of, we can remove all of our clamps and start taking care of our edge work for the door. Now for the door, as you can see down this line, it is a bit rough. In order to make sure we have a clean and smooth area for our metal to fit into, I do highly suggest taking a round over drill bit and going over all of the edges of your door. Our angled steel is slightly rounded on the inside corner, and therefore if we didn't do this, the trim wouldn't lay flush up against our door. Now that we've cut both ends as well as routed the sides, we want to make sure the thing is actually square. So we have 86 3/4, and if we go to the opposite side, we have 86 3/4. That is perfect. Now we can move on to the next step. And as for the next step, you certainly don't have to do this, but I'm using this super black Indian ink to dye the back panel of the plywood. Because some people will eventually see, or at least it can be seen, I want to make sure that it still has a nice finish that complements the front of the door and is still more of a dark, rich color. And if you take a very small amount of this Indian ink, dilute it with some water, and guess what? You have a perfect rustic stain that you can put on the plywood, and it dries very quickly, and guess what? You don't even have to finish it. You just can leave it as is. Now that our trim is dried out appropriately, I can start assembling all of our trim panels. I pre-drill my holes, but obviously make sure you don't drill all the way through from the top side, and then secure the back side first. Once the back side's in place, then I pre-drill my holes on the side of our door and insert fasteners on that side as well. Now keep in mind that I am using 2 different screws, and you certainly don't have to, but because the shortest black screws that I could find at Home Depot were 1 5/8 inches, that means that those screws were going to be too long for the back side of our steel trim, because if I did screw them in place, guess what? They would be sticking out the front. Just keep that in mind on your project. As you can see from this viewpoint, the steel lengths weren't long enough for this 80-inch long door, and therefore I had to cut 2 small sections at the very bottom, which fit snugly into place. Now that we have that taken care of, we can move on to our barn door hardware. I picked up a kit on Amazon, which was a great price, high quality, and I'll make sure and leave a link for this, as well as any of the other materials and tools that you see on this video, including the mirror that we picked up at IKEA. I apply some blue painter's tape to the door first, then mark my hole locations, and then pre-drill all of my holes for each door hardware hanger. The tape provides a really nice, easy way to indicate where your holes need to be placed, as well as easy cleanup and removal. Once we have that removed, go ahead and place a couple washers here. Now you don't have to add those washers, but because our metal trim is slightly proud of our walnut slabs, that means that it would push our brackets slightly ajar, and therefore if we want it perfectly straight, we want to add those washers because that will give us a nice perfect alignment in the end. Go ahead and tighten up your fasteners, and let's move on to the wall. Now I'm not going to go into too much detail on this wall specifically because everyone's wall and project opening is going to be different, but on this project I did have some existing trim that I removed and I wanted to keep the opening casework, therefore I just filled the hole with some wood putty, let that dry, then sanded it down smooth, then used some hot mud to mud all of the corners. After we had the mud applied properly, let that dry, and once we come back to it, we can sand it properly, apply our wall texture, which in this case is going to be a fine orange peel finish. Then after that fully dries out, we can start painting. For the purposes of this project, we're just going to apply a couple layers of white, but we might use a different color down the road. After we have our paint fully dried out, I can come back to it and start installing our hardware for our track system. The one thing you have to think about is the fact that you need to make sure you hit as many studs as humanly possible because this door is quite heavy. Somehow, some way, we have a wall where I hit studs at every single location. Yeah, I still can't believe that we actually were able to do this, but yep. We hit studs at every single location with the existing track. If we couldn't, we'd have to build and install a base plate that would actually install to the wall where the studs were, and then install our track onto that. If you're lucky enough to install your track directly into the studs, just make sure you first pre-drill your holes, and once all of your holes are pre-drilled, you can fasten every single bolt securely into the stud. Just double check your levelness in order to determine and make sure that you won't have any issues with it sliding one way or the other after you have the door installed. Once that's taken care of, go ahead and install your stop plates on both sides. After you have that taken care of, bring in your door and make sure it fits properly. Because guess what? If it does, we are done. I absolutely love how this entire system turned out. From the beautiful wood slabs to the accent trim that matches the barn door hardware, it all ties together beautifully. Except, of course, for the mirror. Yeah, the mirror has a very large crack down it, which I believe was most likely due to me clamping just a little too vigorously. So if you take on this project, make sure you just clamp a couple times at the end and then put a couple weights in the middle. That way you're not putting too much force in the center of the mirror. I assure you this mirror will be fixed, but if you do have any tips on how to fix it without removing it, let me know in the comments below. But no matter what, this is truly one beautiful, sexy beast. Oh yeah.